Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Governing Body Meeting in Common. We have governing bodies of South Tyneside CCG, Sunderland CCG and Durham CCG all assembled remotely online to discuss and make some determinations on the new NHS national finance regime for the second half of this financial year, and something that we are doing together as one group, as obviously the decisions that each CCG makes at this point will affect the other CCGs around us, so we are intending to make a decision together today. This meeting is a single item agenda meeting, extraordinarily outside of the usual governing body schedules of the three organisations, because of the way that the financial allocations have been received by the CCGs from central NHS. So can I just, for formality's sake, please double check that anybody present has any conflicts of interest, and now is the time to declare them. I don't feel there's likely to be, but we need to give people the opportunity. Good. So I'm not going to do introductions. We have got lots of people around here. It'll take up pretty much all the meeting if we do all introduce ourselves. If you are going to speak, it would be great if you could just introduce yourself very briefly so that everybody listening knows who you are before you speak. If you speak for the first time, colleagues, that would be very helpful for other governing bodies and also for anybody, many members of the public who might be watching this online, either now or in the future. It is going to be archived, I believe, on the YouTube channels of the CCGs. So I'll introduce myself, since I didn't do that to the start. I'm Matthew Wormsley. I'm the chair of South Tyneside CCG. I'll be chairing this meeting today, having drawn the short straw, I believe, amongst the three chairs. I'll hand over very quickly then to the paper, and I believe Neil O'Brien is down as the sponsor of the paper. I don't know, Neil, whether you want to do a brief introduction and then hand over to one of the finance officers, or whether you're going to talk us through the whole lot.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. Yeah, so I think the agreement is Dave Chandler's going to take us through the paper, and then at the end he's going to just pass to me for some final comment before opening for questions.
Yes,
so Dave?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Neil. So yes, I've also drawn that straw, Matthew, or the honour of presenting the paper today. I'm David Chandler. I'm the Chief Finance Officer and the Deputy Chief Officer at NHS Sunderland CCG. So hopefully the paper you have in front of you today is a very straightforward paper. It's concise, and I'm sure you've all read it. Also, I only intend to go over the main points. I would note at the start it's been quite a challenging paper to produce, given that NHS allocations for the second half of the year were only announced on the 16th of September. And here we are having to submit plans and the like on the 28th, 29th of September. So that really only gave us 12 days to pull things together. In terms of, I'm sure you'll all be aware, the NHS months 1 to 6 finance regime was based on set allocations, block contracts and central top-ups for additional necessary expenditure to get organisations to break even as we went through the COVID pandemic. However, for months 7 to 12, the financial regime changes again. It's still set on set allocations and block contracts, but the top-up process has gone and is being replaced with a system allocations process that NHS England believe are sufficient to allow systems to manage recovery, COVID, and break even. This framework also formalises system-wide working at an ICP level by placing effectively a financial duty on the ICP to achieve break even rather than just at an organisational level. I think we've all been aware that that is the general direction of travel. Apart from CCG core allocations, there are effectively 3 system allocations that we need to apply across the system as a system. The first of those are top-ups or defunds that have been presented to us at an organisational level by NHS England Improvement for CCGs and foundation trusts. And you can see in the paper, we highlight that CCGs have in effect have had a non-recurrent defund of £18.8 million, and foundation trusts an increase in top-ups to enable them to achieve break-even of £24.9 million. That's a net increase of £6.1 million. Secondly, there is a system COVID fund of £32.4 million, which I'll come on to in a second, and a system growth fund, although that is only £5.9 million across the ICP system. So this paper and the attached MOU aims to detail and recommend how these funds should be allocated. So, for example, on the COVID fund, the proposal is that based on need, £22.1 million would be allocated to foundation trusts and £10.3 million would be allocated to CCGs. In terms of the System Growth Fund, which, as I say, is just £5.9 million, which in the grand scheme of things is equivalent to approximately 0.5% of CCG allocations, the proposal is that this is used as a risk reserve to assist the ICP and organisations within to manage unmitigated financial pressures. As such, £3.5 million is played out within the plan, £2.1 million to Sunderland CCG and £1.4 million to Sunderland and South Tyneside Foundation Trust, or South Tyneside and Sunderland Foundation Trust, I should say. The financial plan being submitted for the ICP includes the following key points. The proposed financial plan being submitted. It includes a 4.1 million deficit in Sunderland CCG, which has been driven by technical issues in the CCG's target financial figure. For now, while we actively pursue those errors as we perceive them, this has been offset by approximately £2 million of risk reserve funding and is offset by £2 million surplus across the ICP. An overall £9 million deficit for the ICP is being reported. This is driven by an unrealistic expectation, in our opinion, by NHS England Improvement that Sunderland and South Tyneside Foundation Trust can return its non-NHS income back to 2019-20 levels. Across the NHS, many foundation trusts are saying that is an unrealistic expectation. I just want to highlight that it's just not one foundation trust saying that. There is a multitude up and down the country saying that. So in summary, the financial plan for the ICP that we wish to submit, so I'm just getting feedback there, states that we can only achieve break-even if NHS England Improvement provide the ICP an additional £9 million of funding. We will not probably be alone in submitting a plan that looks like that. Okay. Risks on top of this are such as the elective incentive scheme are listed in the paper. There's a number of risks and mitigations, as we've noted, are limited. The risks are dynamic, they're moving. We're going to be working at this for like 12 days. And I'll give you an example. Just yesterday afternoon, we became aware that mental health providers and CCGs have been given conflicting advice regarding the funding of mental health pressures. For Sunderland CCG, that would represent a risk of approximately £1 million. So that just gives you an idea of the pace that we're working in at the moment. Last, I'd like to say, in terms of further updates on plans and assurance, you can be assured that all CFOs will be keeping their respective governing bodies and audit committee chairs updated on the latest developments and progress. So they were the main points that I wanted to share in the paper, Chair. I think Neil might want to just add a few points on top of that, if that's okay.
Yes, thanks, David. Sorry. That's great. Just a couple of bits of feedback that we've had, I've had from across the system that might ease our discussion. When I spoke with Ian yesterday, there was concern about the assurance rating for CCGs if they ended up posting a deficit position. What we have been told is that what is most important is system balance. So and we are actively encouraged to offset surpluses in one organisation against deficits in the other in order to reach system balance. So as long as we reach system balance, then I think it would be very unfair and not in line with all the discussions that we've had at an ICS level, that if any one individual organisation was in that position, that it would affect their assurance rating. But as we know, the assurance process is changing a lot for CCGs anyway. The other thing I'd like to say is that this is a moment in time, if you like. Things are changing very, very quickly. We are not sure if Sunderland FT will get any of the £9 million non-NHS income. There is still the technical challenges that Dave Chandler mentioned of the 4.1. Where that's wrapped up in the 4.1 million for Sunderland CCG. So there's other things that will come out in the following months, and what we're asking governing bodies to do is to be aware of these things and just agree this approach. There's been some questions that I've had across the ICP about how we determine the split between the foundation trusts and CCGs. The first thing to remember is that when this COVID top-up money came down initially, it was said that none of this really was intended to be used in primary care at all. And then they quickly backtracked on that because that's a recognition. The vast majority of the costs here are within our foundation trusts. But I think we think it's important as a system that we do recognise the pressures across the entire system in community care, social care, the problems that care homes are also experiencing, and in primary care, which is where we've managed to secure a pot, if you like, for those kind of issues of the £10.3 million. We got to the position of the FT request from information gleaned from gold, silver commands of the FTs, where clinicians from the CCGs across the ICP have been involved in those discussions, and that was felt it was a fair reflection of their requirements to have a safe hospital service, which is essential as we go into the winter. Just a little bit on the decision making on this, and this is an odd one. We are the statutory organisation, so we do get to make the decision on this. However, we are moving into a way of system working. I don't think we can impose a decision on other partners, and I think if we get to that point, then we would have failed in our system working approach. So I think it is a little odd, and I'm finding it as strange as anyone else. I think we need to agree in a position from the commissioning groups, and we've worked in true partnership and collaboration with the foundation trusts to get to this position. The FTs do still, though, however, have a requirement to tell us what they're spending their money on, and I think we need to strike the balance where the FTs need to be fleet of foot as they have to have that flexibility to respond quickly if they need to bring extra staff in, open additional beds, whatever it is. But I think it would be amiss of us as a commissioning organisation not to have some element of oversight and scrutiny as to what they have spent their money on. But what we can't have is for them to put in applications and business cases, wait for a committee of the CCG before they actually implement some of these essential changes for this coming winter, which may be very, very pressured. So I think the other thing that I wanted to pick out is that this is really difficult stuff to do. The easiest thing to do is to just say, right, we'll fair share split across all of the CCGs and you can manage yourself. But that's not true system working, because there's some real pressures coming up in parts of our ICP, particularly in the Sunderland FT CCG system at the minute. And I think it would be, and I think the CFOs and DOFs have shown a really impressive, mature approach to saying, right, we need to think about our entire system here. It's not just about our own organisation. We need to think about what's essential in community, what we can do with the smaller amount of pot that we have left, and how do we play that out, which is where the idea came from about the group, which looks at that kind of reserve pot, which will be chaired by myself. And then we can get clinicians and managers from all of the CCGs to jointly decide where that money goes. That money may go to entirely to one organisation, if that is where we demonstrate the need is. And that's the important thing here. We don't have equal populations across the ICP. The need is different across the ICP. As responsible commissioning organisations and as a single NHS, we need to be able to have the flexibility to play that money into areas of greatest need. And it's that word need and addressing health inequalities within the community that I think is very, very important that we have the ability to do. So that's probably all I wanted to say. I think it's been a difficult process to get us here. I think we are in the ICS probably in one of the best places. There are larger gaps elsewhere within the ICS, but I've been really impressed with the way in which, and I think governing bodies should be, that the chief officers and the CFOs have worked collaboratively with the directors of finance in the trust to get to this position. So that's all I need to say. So over to questions, Matthew.
Thanks. Can I just invite, before we go to questions, can I just invite the CFOs from the other two CCGs who haven't spoken, just to add anything that they feel is particularly relevant to either South Tyneside from Kate's point of view or Durham from Richard's point of view, and then we'll move on to general questions from other colleagues. So Richard.
Hi, so Richard Henderson, Chief Finance Officer for County Durham CCG. I think David's covered the main points in the paper. The only bit I would add, it is referenced in there, is whilst the top-up process in the main is removed in the second half of the year, we do still expect retrospective top-up for the hospital discharge programme costs. So we've referenced a £32.5 million COVID pot for the ICP within the paper. We do expect additional funding to flow through the CCGs to cover hospital discharge programme costs, which is the largest COVID-related cost of the CCGs.
Richard, sorry, could you just mention the break glass clause as well? I forgot to mention that.
So there is a break glass clause. I'm not entirely sure what the trigger would be for that. So it's designed in the event of a kind of second wave that this could all be off the table and we could be back to something like the arrangements in the first 6 months of the year. But what exactly would trigger that and what it would then look like is still up in the air.
Thanks, Richard. And then Kate.
Thank you, Matthew. So I'm Kate Hudson, Chief Finance Officer for South Tyneside CCG. I think David presented the paper very well, so thank you for that, David. I suppose the only other thing I would draw out is the fact that if we are unsuccessful in securing the additional £9 million worth of income that we are going to be asking for, then we do need to continue to work on how we would deliver a balanced plan for the ICP, and that work's underway at the moment.
Thanks very much, Kate. I'm going to go to questions from the group now. It's difficult for me to see anybody waving at me or talking because there's actually 4 times as many people on the call as I've got faces on my screen. So I'm going to use the little yellow hands that can go up. So far I've got Chris Backlin, then Anne Fox, then Stuart Findlay. So Chris.
Thank you, Matthew. Chris Macklin, non-clinical vice chair of Sunderland CCG and audit chair. Thanks to the CFOs for putting the paper together. I had the opportunity yesterday. DC spent an hour with me going through the paper, so I was really pleased and grateful for that. Enabled me to get into some of the detail that perhaps you would expect audit chairs and others to get into. I was really pleased to hear as to how well the CFOs and the FDs from the FTs have worked on this, to the extent that I think that there is a genuine open book approach. I know during the process, DC informed me about an issue that arose in one of the FTs that the other FT was unaware of. And if as a consequence of the way that they have handled something in their accounts, it means that they then may or may not gain something in the future, there's an understanding now that that won't go direct to that organisation, but it will then come back into the central system, as it were, and will be managed collectively. And that may entail that individual organisation showing a greater surplus or deficit than it has hitherto, which would then be offset by the others. So, you know, I very much, you know, welcome that approach. I think the concept of allocating allocations to where they should be, I think is the correct one to do. And if that means that organisations then either move into surplus or unfortunately remain in deficit, that's something that I'm pretty sure the auditors will look to see how we have accounted for that. So I think there is probably one of the next steps that we need to do would be to brief the auditors. I think we will have the same. I think South Tyneside have got Mazars, not sure about Durham, but we need to make sure that our auditors are up to speed, because what we don't want is to approve something and then down the line the auditors say, well, why have you done that? You should have left that there and reported a different number. So I think that's a job in hand that I'm sure the CFOs would be able to remedy. And my last point is just a nervousness around the governance side of the memorandum of understanding, and it's just I'm just wondering whether or not it's possible to weave in some lay member input into some of that decision making around amendments to plans and things like that. Now, notwithstanding what Neil was saying about needing to be fleet of foot, and I fully get that, but I'm just wondering whether there, from a governance perspective, it would add to the paper if there can be some lay member input. Obviously, I'm looking at audit chairs, and there may be others who would want to just be there as a sounding board if there is something that needs to be done, so that again we can assure ourselves about what's going on. So that's just a few comments from myself. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Neil, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, thank you for the recognition of that. The maturity of working, and as for lay member involvement, in the right place where we're making these, because as you say, we're developing this as we go along. Absolutely, I've got no particular problem with that. But so maybe it's a discussion for the CFOs with. Maybe yourself and John, as how that's played in. So I'm more than happy with that.
And is that something that it's possible at this stage to write into the memorandum of understanding, or the sort of version whatever next we're up to, Dave?
Chair, if I can come in response to Chris. I mean, I can't speak for the other CFOs, but I can sort of see them and they may nod or shake their head when I say this. But if we do need to materially change the plan, then we will need to bring this back to governing bodies to say that the plan is completely changed now because of that. That's in line with the scheme of delegation, obviously. And, as you know, Chris, I would always engage with you in terms of, OK, this is where we're up to and this is what we need to do, and take sounding boards from you. So I think what you're asking for is generally implicit there anyway. Certainly from a Sunderland perspective, we would do that anyway. I don't think we necessarily have to put it in the MOU, because I think that is how we have to work and how we do work. But of course, I can only say that from a Sunderland perspective. So I see your point. I don't know if it adds anything personally in putting it into the MOU, because that for me is the operatus modus, if that's the right Latin phraseology. Forgive me, been a long time. But that's how I would expect us to operate anyway. But I don't know if Richard and Kate want to come into there to maybe just assure everybody on that front.
Okay, Kate, and then Richard, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. If anything significant material changes, then yeah, we would bring it back to GB.
Richard?
Yeah, same here.
So we're content then that we've got the commitment from the Chief Finance Officers to involve GB, the Audit Committee, in the appropriate scrutiny of what goes on, but an understanding that that will happen without necessarily being written into the memorandum of understanding. Lots of nods around the screen there. Okay, that's great. Thanks for that clarification, Chris. If we've dealt with that, can I move on to Anne Fox, the next question?
Thanks, Chair. Good morning. Hi, Anne Fox. I'm Exec Director of Nursing, Quality and Safety for Sunderland CCG. Just a couple of points. And firstly, on the cover sheet, just for accuracy, there'll be no surprise that I'm going to mention quality impact assessment and equality impact assessment. I suppose just to note, we are a moment in time. I recognise the fast pace of this work and how it's developed. But I think just the statement that's in there around why we haven't done those two assessments, we are actually being asked to make a decision today. I think it's just important to note for accuracy that the decision we're making today, we don't envisage having any impact on patient care as things stand at the moment, accepting that's obviously this challenge before us is a movable feast. I think in terms of the MOU, I would just suggest a couple of areas where we could strengthen that. Again, no surprise that I'm going to mention it, linked to quality and safety and inequalities. I think it's implied in the principles section where we say we're going to have clinician involvement in decision making. Actually, in light of what we know post-COVID, etc., I think it's really important that we're explicit in that MOU and add in that we'll have some quality and safety expertise and inequalities expertise. Similarly, I think in the governance, you would be wanting to look at quality information, as in safety, effectiveness, experience, hold on to experience, and inequalities rather than just finance and performance. So I've sent a few words to DC last night because I think that will really help us strengthen and make explicit, as we say, how we would normally operate. But I think it's really important in these times that it's explicit within there. And I would maybe suggest that that quality expertise comes from one of our exec directors of nursing who are holding those statutory duties, mainly because I think that gives then a direct link, certainly that is it in Sunderland, towards patient and public involvement, because I think for us to be able to manage any of those quick responses that we may need to do to change the plan or indeed change some of the services that we commission or how they operate, I think we need to be very quickly looking at how do we do that involvement. I don't mean consultation, I'm talking at the lower end of involvement because of the timeframes in which we'll need to make decisions. We're going to have to be really smart about how we do that so that our residents in all of our areas understand the decisions we're having to make and why. Thank you.
Matthew, if I can just come back quickly on that, I think you're absolutely right, and I think quality and safety considerations in playing out the financial plan during COVID do need to be have due consideration, and I guess also the intelligence that you have about quality within the care home sector as well, which we absolutely need to ensure we support throughout the winter. So absolutely support your comments there, and if you have got some words there for DC and some suggestions of how we make sure that this is not just purely a financial discussion, would be really appreciated. Thank you for that.
Thanks. I'm just thinking through the governance of how we're going to get this MOU and the associated things signed off and approved. If we're changing the text as we go along through the meeting today.
So if I could suggest that maybe these are kind of small amendments of some emphasis on principles, then what we could do is we could maybe agree this with the comments that have been made, and then we could just circulate it, and then if anyone has any major objections, then we may have to then come back again. But if not, then I think we can take it as agreed, if that's okay with everybody.
Yeah, that will sound reasonable. Thanks for that suggestion. Okay, thanks, Anne, for the don't think anyone's disagreeing with you, Alan. Can we move on then to the next person on my list, which is Stuart Finley from DDES, well, County Durham as is now. Stuart, I don't know if you're saying anything. You're still on mute.
Sorry, Stuart Finley, Chief Officer, Durham. Common mistake these days to forget to unmute, I'm afraid. David, I was just wondering if you could explain a little bit more to me about the grid on at the end of section 5. I mean, first of all, on the paper, it is a little difficult to get your head round all of the figures. It would have been helpful, I think, to have a table with all of the allocations, to FTs and all the allocations to CCGs on one page. But just looking in particular at the one at the end of section 5, on the growth funding, I mean, obviously there's a 1.4 million going to South Tyneside and 2.1 million going to Sunderland and 0 going to County Durham. How was that split decided? And on the face of it, this doesn't look like a fair allocation. So is this money being already committed or already spent? I mean, how did we finish up in that position?
Matthew, I'm happy to try and answer that question if you like. Your first part of your question, Stuart, in terms of it would be nice or helpful to have all the additional information you talk about in terms of the splits. It isn't in the paper. We want to get the paper concise and stick to the main points. Obviously, that can be shared with yourself. Your CFO will have that level of detail, and we've all shared those numbers quite openly and transparently across the ICP when we've been doing these calculations. In terms of the risk share, as I think Neil was saying earlier, the principle is being based on need, where have we landed, and then what do we need to mitigate. We've identified that 2 organisations, have pressures once we dish out, if you like, the implications of the non-recurrent adjustments and the top-up funding for organisations. As you know, they're based on national formulas, and national formulas often don't work when you get down to local issues. So we have allocated some funding, and we did this at CFO to Director of Finance level, where we, constructively challenged each other on all these numbers and asked to be ensured that, if you like, the kitchen sink had been thrown at organisational issues. So where money has been funded to organisations, that's because they couldn't quite get there. The risk reserve, I think, will be flexible. It will move over time. Other organisations will identify additional flexibilities, and organisations will identify the pressures. What we've agreed to do is collectively manage that risk, because if we can't manage the ICP, if the ICP fails, or one organisation fails in the ICP, so we have, say, a £2 million overspend at the end of the year, we will all have been deemed to have failed. And that's something that we need to ensure we avoid in all circumstances. So hopefully that gives you information about the process that was followed and how we got to those numbers and where we are at this point in time. And if Richard and Kate would like to add to that, I'm sure they can do.
Either Richard or Kate?
Can I just make a point for clarity that the growth funding is allocated to STSFT, not South Tyneside CCG and Sunderland CCG, in order to present this this plan today? Just clarity there, that's going to the FT and the CCG. But as Dave has said, we do hold it as a risk reserve to be played out. If pressures come up anywhere else in the system, then we will need to jointly consider that.
So I still don't understand. So that money that's sitting with Sunderland CCG is a risk reserve for the whole ICP.
Shall I come in? I don't know if that's helpful. So the remaining money, I think, is about £3 million that is the risk reserve, is sitting with County Durham CCG at the moment. They're hosting that pot. The £2.1 million that's been given to Sunderland CCG and the 1.4 to South Tyneside and Sunderland FT was to balance their position, because otherwise they would have been in deficit.
Right. So Sunderland CCG is currently in deficit and needs that 2.1 million to rectify that.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. I understand now.
Thanks very much. I hope that's answered the question there, Stuart. The next person on my list for a comment is Tracy Lucas. Tracy.
Hello, thank you, Chair. My name is Tracy Lucas. I'm a GP and I'm one of the exec GPs at Sunderland CCG. It's a very quick question around how will the system allocation group connect appropriately with our place-based systems. For example, in Sunderland we have an ATB, which mainly deals, but not exclusively, out of hospital care. So I'm just keen to make sure that we're not inadvertently going to create a parallel system where we're trying to work at system level across the whole ICP, but then individually we're delivering something slightly different at place-based level. So it's in case we end up with two separate sets of groups in each CCG, not thinking about balancing the in and out of hospital needs at place-based level. It's a really tricky question, and probably we've not got there yet, but I just wanted some assurance around that.
So I can maybe respond to that, Matthew, if you like. Obviously, the that system allocation group, I know we've just made that name up, if you like. The representation of that would be drawn from each of the places, and then each place would come forward if there was a particular pressure, just to discuss that across the ICP and say, look, there's a real need here because, I don't know, Care Home X is on its knees and it needs an injection of money or whatever. We would jointly consider that as and across the pressures that are across the whole system, and then say, okay, yes, that's a legitimate call on that, on that funding. Yes, go ahead and do whatever. What I would say is that the most important thing is that we do what is right for the population. We do need to reach system balance, yes, but I think as we move through this winter period, we can't let money be the main issue here, and it goes back to Anne's point, I think. So it'll be in representation in that group, Tracy. Obviously, we have members of our Sunderland exec and clinicians and non-clinicians who are members of the ATB as well. So we can make sure that we've just got fair representation from across the system. But it won't be that group will be very much high-level strategic. Yes, here's a piece of money to do what your local system has asked for. It's not going to be planning and doing the specifics like what the ATB will be doing in Sunderland.
Thanks very much for the question, Tracy, and for the answer. I hope that satisfied your question, Tracy. Next on my list is Fadi Khalil.
Hello, good morning. I'm Fadi Khalil. I'm elected GP at Sunderland CCG. I'm going to caveat what I'm going to say next with recognising and appreciating the amount of work that went in from David, Kate and Richard to get this paper now within a couple of weeks or less than a couple of weeks. And I agree it's not an easy task. However, it makes me think, what is the function of the CCG? We're a clinical commissioning group. This does not sound of anything that's clinical. There hasn't been any clinical input in this. I'm not sure what we are commissioning with this. It seems like we're just plugging financial gaps. And finally, I don't know what we get with this. So as a commissioner, it doesn't matter how you cut the cake if the whole cake goes in the bin. So whether it's 8 slices or 6 slices, it all ends up in the FT. So there's about 60 million in that paper, 50 million of which are going to the FT to plug gaps.
So can I come back in on that point of clinical involvement first? It's worth noting that I've been very involved in this process, and I am a practicing clinician. So there's clinical involvement throughout our entire organisation. You have a clinician who is your accountable officer, and we have 3 clinical chairs, and I have regular contact with them. Also, on the point of clinical involvement, the plans that have been drawn up in local places, of course, have been involving clinicians, the design of hot hubs, all of this kind of stuff that this plan supports. Again, has a lot of clinical involvement. I do believe that there's very active involvement of ATB, which has got a lot of clinicians on it in Silver Command within the FT, and the FT plans that were presented of their requirements again fed into this process. So I think it would be a little unfair to say that there has been no clinical involvement. This has been done very quickly, and remember, we are looking at how do we allocate. It's at a very high level. And it is a lot of it is a financial discussion, because we do have to come into in on plan. We've tried to keep a sensible risk reserve. We've tried to say, yes, the things that are consistent and pre-committed in all of the CCGs and those plans that have been worked up by clinicians within the CCGs, try to honour as many of those as we can, but also having that flexibility where there'll be absolutely clinical involvement in that resource allocation group to ensure that we do whatever money we have left in the system risk reserve is played out in the most clinically appropriate way. We'd really have tried to do this in the most efficient way and involve clinicians in every step of the way. So I think it's I mean, if you've got any other suggestions of how we could do that, of course, happy to hear that.
So going back to my point, so we're not commissioning anything with this. It's very high level. We're paying 50 million into the FTs. We're not seeing what we're getting back for it at a time of abysmal performance. We know that primary care, community care has bent over backwards to support the system, yet we are rewarding the part of the system that's not performing well. The 50 million ends up being in the FT, because whether it's in the COVID funds or whether it's in the system top of funding, it ends up in the FT. On the clinical input, we had this discussion elsewhere, and we did say that elected GPs are clinical leaders of the CCGs. You act as an accountable officer, Neil. However, moving forward, I think we need to consider these points in the MOU. Okay. So the MOU, again, as Chris had mentioned, the last bullet point talks about that the chief execs and the officers of the CCG will approve collectively plans, etc. We have one accountable officer, so there is one person doing the 3 jobs, as far as I understand. So we just need to be mindful of the clinical leadership of the CCGs, because we are remaining as a CCG. We're not a financial group. We're not an NHS England group. I mean, they might as well cut out the middleman. So if I'm very honest, if this is the direction we're being sent on, that we are just the middleman, cutting allocations or dividing allocations that end up in the same place, then might as well cut out the middleman. I don't feel comfortable being a CCG. This will go through. I'm absolutely certain this will go through absolutely fine. But I will not dignify it with a vote. So I am abstaining from voting on this paper, knowing very well it will go through because it needs to happen, and we're at times of crisis. But it will not. I will not dignify it with a clinical vote. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, as I said, maybe we could have a conversation out with the meeting about how we maybe make it feel more comfortable, if you like, the how clinicians are deciding how that pot is played out. I know I'm the accountable officer, but I still do 2 days of face-to-face clinical practice. I can't separate myself. I might not be a Sunderland clinician, but I am a system clinician. But you're right. I do have a different role. But let's so I appreciate your comments and your honesty, and I think that's they're valid points to make. But as I say, we're trying to the financial regime has been imposed upon us, if you like, very rapidly, and we're trying to make very sensible decisions as a system. Yeah, it's not easy. David Chandler, I don't know if you want to come in and say more on that.
Can I just say, I mean, I'll take the chair's prerogative to butt in at any point, and I do think that in terms of the question of what are we commissioning, what are we buying with this money? In fact, we're buying a COVID response from Trust. We're buying a completely different way of working, a completely different set of of activity than was planned 6 to 9 months ago for this year. So I do get the fact that we are commissioning something very different with this pot of money, and we're doing it in a different way, and that's the plan there. Now, I don't know whether Dave Chandler wants to answer anything further from that particular point of Faddy's. And I've got Sarah Burns and Matt Brown waiting to come in, and then we're going probably at that point we're going to have to draw it to a close and actually make some decisions. So Dave.
Yeah, I'll just be very brief then, Chair, because you both probably just hit it on the nail on the head anyway. In terms of commissioning, we're not really commissioning this in the traditional sense of the word. We're being asked to work as a system to agree the utilisation of these resources. So it's not like just a CCG decision, and that is really different to what we've had in the past. I think in terms of the clinical engagement, I think yes, we can do more of that and better of that. I think that group that I can't remember the term that Neil used for it. I think we do need to use that to do more of that and keep working in line with our scheme delegations. I wish we'd had longer to do this. I honestly do. That would have helped those type of conversations. But we've been given unrealistic timeframes to try and pull something together that we can actually submit. And others will submit on time. So I totally hear what Faddy's saying, and I totally respect his views. And hopefully we'll be able to accommodate those going forward.
Thanks, Dave. Let's move on then to next point from Sarah Burns.
Thanks, Matthew. I do sympathise with a lot of the comments that Faddy makes. I think as a CCG, certainly in Durham, our commitment is to expand growth, increase growth in out-of-hospital services, and this feels that we are perhaps not doing that on this occasion, but for completely understandable reasons, because what we're required to do is react to COVID and make sure that the system's stable throughout COVID. I think it's important to recognise this is a reaction to this current situation, and I think there's a lot of scope for collaboration across the ICB. It's doing it in the right way at the right time, and we would hope that we'll come to a point where we return to our focus on health outcome improvement and not just responding to COVID, and thinking about how we use our funding as commissioners to best effect to do that in future.
Sarah, there's a point just popped up there that some people are not quite aware who you are and what your role is within the CCG, so if you could introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry, I forgot about that. I'm Sarah Burns, and I'm the Joint Head of Commissioning for the CCG and Durham County Council.
Thanks very much, Sarah. I think that's a point well made, that it's perhaps not what we would be have always wanted to do and how we would always have wanted to conduct our business, but these are extraordinary times, and so we've been asked to respond in extraordinary ways. That's a point well made. Neil, do you want to respond to anything that Sarah said, or do you want to move on to Matt Brown?
No, I'm fine with what Sarah said. I think she's highlighted, yes, we are in very extraordinary times. So yeah, I'm happy to go on to the next question. Okay,
so Matt Brown.
Morning, thanks. Yeah, it's Matt Brown, Executive Director of Operations at South Tyneside CCG. I think my points have been made, to be honest, by Sarah and yourself, Matthew, which was, I guess, firstly, this is the first time our three governing bodies have met in this way, and I think it's really healthy that we have this kind of debate. That's the purpose of these forums, isn't it? Is to make sure we have healthy challenge. I think I was just going to say the CFOs, I think, have done an unbelievable job of trying to create some certainty in a very uncertain environment while we deal with this national pandemic, global pandemic. So I think full credit to you. I think it gives us a good chance of giving us some space to get on with the things that are really important for the people we serve, for our populations across South Tyneside, Sunderland, County Durham. So thank you for all the work you've done on that.
Thank you, Matt. And there's one final hand that's come up, which is Jonathan Smith. And although I did say, and Ian Patterson, will allow both the other chairs then a final say before we move on to actually making a decision. So Jonathan, then Ian.
Thank you. I'm Jonathan Smith. I'm Chair of Durham CCG. I just wanted to thank everyone for the really helpful comments and questions. I think it's right to give this the level of questioning that it's received. I think we return to the point of the meeting and the paper. It's the maturity of organisations, working for the best outcomes for the whole system. And as long as we can have confidence in the honesty and openness of all organisations in how the money is being spent, where it's going, I think governing bodies will get the reassurance we need. But I really want to thank those comments and those questions. I think it's been really helpful discussion. That was all.
Thanks, Jonathan. And Ian?
Hi, Ian Patterson, GP and Clinical Chair of Sunderland CCG. It's just to pick up a couple of points that I did ask to be covered. Thank you, Neil, for covering the point around the assurance rating. I think I'd feel more comfortable if we could get that in writing rather than feeling it would be unfair, but whether or not that would be forthcoming. But I think from our perspective currently, as the finances stand, you can understand why I would say I'd like that in writing, if at all possible. If somebody could pursue that, I'm sure the board would be supportive in Sunderland. I think the second point to support is the last paragraph of the MOU, something that Fadi and Chris picked up upon. I was reassured to hear that we're not stepping outside agreed schemes of delegation there, so that was reassuring for me as well. So thank you for that. I think final point would just be to pick up on something Fadi said, because I think it was very clear. Some of the issues there raised are things that we often think about, but I think it's this concept of system, and the system being the FTs and the CCGs, and the system's actually much wider than that. Now, I know from an NHS England perspective, I've been doing this long enough to know what makes the wheels on the bus go round. But I think as we move forward, the NHS long-term plan does make clear that we're supposed to put equal gravitas to in-hospital and out-of-hospital systems, and if anything, shift resources preferentially from in to out. And I just wonder how we're going to mature this as we go forward in the future to make sure that, that there is equal representation. I'm aware at the moment these discussions primarily are chief executives of FTs, yourself, Neil, and the DOFs correspondingly. And there's not a sort of cohesive out-of-hospital social care element to that, though I know there has been inclusion in the discussions to try and get there, primarily fed through the CCGs. But just wondering, as we go forward, how we mature that. Aside that, I welcome the paper. I think we've made the best of the hand we've been dealt. I think we should support as governing bodies our DOFs in their pushback to NHS England in challenging their financial calculations, because we know that there are errors in there, and we would like to see those, I'm sure, as governing bodies sort of corrected to the positive, of course. And it's just to put my support behind the paper and thank everybody who's worked on it in the incredibly tight timescales, taken on board. It's never going to be perfect when you get 12 days and at month 7 you get an allocation. So thank you for everybody who's worked on it. Thank you.
Matthew, can I just make a point on that? I think Ian's absolutely right. The system is wider, and I think we can demonstrate as 3 CCGs over the years how we have shifted that pendulum from FT investment to community investment. I think we can all do that, and strategically, that I don't think that premise has changed. This is very much to deal with this issue of this financial regime in extraordinary circumstances in the next 6 months. As to how we embed the wider system in how we make decisions going forward, I think that, that is obviously strengthen integrated place-based arrangements, which we're all committed to doing, and also the ICP. How's that made up? What's the membership? How wide is that? That needs to be reflective of the whole system, and that's all work that we're progressing. And of course, further updates, I'm sure you'll be all very excited to hear coming up.
Thanks very much. Thanks everybody for your contributions. We do have a number of specific asks that the paper is making of each governing body, and we are a meeting of governing bodies in common, of course, rather than a joint meeting at the moment. So I think it's probably right for me to go through each of the asks and ask formally each of the governing bodies in turn on each of the asks. So if we just look at the paper, each governing body is asked to approve the attached Central ICP 2021 Memorandum of Understanding on behalf of the CCGs. I think what we're actually saying is we're hoping to approve the memorandum with some minor amendments to the text in terms of lay and audit oversight regarding Chris's point and Anne's point around the input of quality teams. So subject to those 2 amendments being made, which will be circulated by email once the text is made, Fanny saying clinical input as well as quality input, which is quite right. Subject to that text being amended and circulated by email, is everybody, each governing body, able to approve that? So I'll just ask Durham, if you disagree, please speak now. South Tyneside, if you disagree, please speak now. And Sunderland, if you disagree, please speak now. I think we'll take that as agreement from each governing body. So the second ask of the paper is to approve the proposed distributions of the different elements of the ICP system funding allocations. And again, I don't think we've made any amendments as we went round there. So equally as we did before, Durham, if you disagree with that, please speak now. South Tyneside, if you disagree with that, please speak now. And Sunderland, if you disagree with that, please speak now. Third ask is that each governing body approves their respective CCG's proposed plan submission and central ICP plan submission showing a 9 million deficit across the ICP. And so once again, I will point out that that's the 9 million deficit that we are hoping would be made up centrally, though we recognise there's a risk that it may not. So once again, Durham, if you disagree, please speak now. South Tyneside, if you disagree, please speak now. Sunderland, if you disagree, please speak now. And I note Ian's request for further assurance in the chat box there. Final ask is that the governing bodies in common agree that the central ICP directors of finance and CFOs continue to lead the development of a plan to address the remaining gap of 9 million should further national funding be made available to address the expected non-NHS income shortfall. And once again, there's been some discussion around that, so if I can ask Durham, if you disagree, please speak now. South Tyneside, if you disagree, please speak now. And Sunderland, if you disagree, please speak now. Thanks everybody, and thank you for your contributions today. Thank you for joining online from consulting rooms, offices, back bedrooms, kitchens around the northeast. Thank you particularly to the CFOs and their teams, of course, for pulling this together at very, very short notice. Thank you to the team who've put the meeting together and made sure that it all ran smoothly, again at fairly short notice. We'll be obviously having minutes of this meeting coming to individual governing bodies rather than waiting for the next governing body meeting in common, though I'm sure we will all see each other again in the not too distant future as we move more and more towards system across the ICP. So that remains for me just to close this meeting, noting I've not been informed of any other business that needs to be raised. And yeah, it's 9:30 on the dot, so time to go to your next meetings, everybody. Thanks very much. Goodbye.